what I'm intent to do is to run through with you your statement, and at appropriate points may ask you to elaborate a little bit, but basically to have it on record, as it were. It's already on record, but just to bring out some points. So in the second paragraph, I think you make the point that messaging through modern technology can target individuals in a persuasive, highly individualized forms. And since there is no need to appeal across the board, targeting at the individual level has corroded the democratic process. Could you explain what you mean, please?
Minister, in the current context of information warfare, as asymmetric warfare doctrine would have it, internal opposition, seeding internal opposition within the target country is extremely important. This is not necessarily entirely new. However, the technological tsunami and the growth of data-rich societies has given the aggressor enormous opportunity to try to subvert individual slices of one particular country, one particular target country, in a way which would have been unthinkable 20, 30 years ago. So some of the obvious examples are out there, Facebook, also messaging services, where, for example, in a country, well, take the Singapore example, you could narrowcast your message to one particular group, an ethnic group, a communal group, a racial group, and say, for example, you are not really Singaporean, appealing to other more ancestral kinds of proclivities and saying you should cleave to that. And that's very, very important because that, in a small, diverse country like Singapore, has the potential to tear a big rent in the social fabric.
Right. Thank you. The next paragraph, modern information technologies empower and incentivize subversion at scale. In cyberspace, there is no requirement, of course, for messages to have a direct connection to the truth, and either way, the perpetrator of falsehoods can mask its tracks and have some degree of plausible deniability. Why not then employ these techniques to undermine resilience in targeted countries, and when these methods can be far cheaper and less bloody than warfare, and which may be more precisely tailored to achieve state aims compared to diplomacy? It was, after all, Sun Tzu who observed that to subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. Would you explain that, please?
Yes, Minister. If you look at some of the current conflicts which are ongoing worldwide now, for example, the Russian annexation of Crimea or their active measures in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, for example, you see the full panoply of this spectrum of active measures on full view, appealing, for example, to the Russian minority in that part of Ukraine, and also spreading lies, rumors, disinformation to say that they are the subject of persecution. So that's spreading disinformation and rumors in the target country. But equally important, and this might not be completely clear in the paragraph, is that you manufacture a truth for your own domestic constituency as well, for the Russian people within Russia, Putin's Russia. There's no doubt at all in their mind that Putin is fighting a just war and that they are protecting other people, Russian minorities elsewhere. The actual degree of verisimilitude, the quality of truth, does not actually matter. What matters more in this case is that the Russian state has achieved its state objectives and got the right people to believe what it wants.
Yes. I think just a point of clarification. I mean, you will have your views, but obviously you can understand the select committee will not take any specific view as to whether President Putin has done something or Russia has done something, yes, or for that matter, China or United States.
Yes, Mr.
But, you know, we hear your views. Next paragraph, the next page. You talk about General Gerasimov, his doctrine. He was the chief of general staff, or is the chief of general staff of the Russian armed forces. And he said, information space opens wide asymmetrical possibilities for reducing the fighting potential of the enemy. A great deal of what Russia has tried in European Union and its former satellites in Europe has disinformation at its heart, spreading rumors to discredit politicians and to play up certain themes, such as negative portrayals of immigration policy, have been aimed at undermining public trust towards democracy and systematically influence populations to become less trusting of mainstream, established news networks. Instead, they would put more trust on fringe sources of news, often backed by Russia and conspiracy narratives. Would you maybe spend a few minutes, because you are the experts and people here don't necessarily know, what is the Gerasimov doctrine?
Yes, Minister. Maybe I could go into a little bit more detail because I was not able to put the full story inside
Yes, please.
Submission. The story really begins with the Gerasimov doctrine around February 13, when in a niche...
February 2013.
February 2013, correct. Right. When a Russian newspaper, there is a Russian name for it, but the English translation is the Military Industrial Courier. It's a niche Russian military publication. Not very exciting publication, usually does not get read, but it reprinted a speech by the Chief General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, where he talked about how in the modern world, the use of propaganda and subversion were not simply civilian tools. They had to be used by militaries as well to achieve their aims in state conflict. And if I may be permitted to quote, he talked about a conflict where, I quote, "A perfectly thriving state can, in a matter of months and even days, be transformed into an arena of fierce armed conflict, become a victim of foreign intervention, and sink into a web of chaos, humanitarian catastrophe, and civil war," unquote. And
where is this quote found?
This is the quote translated from the
original publication. It'll be helpful if you give the original references to us.
These will be provided, Minister.
Thank you. Yeah. Please carry on. Yeah.
My reading of what General Valery Gerasimov was saying is that the use of special forces, hybrid tools of military warfare, as well as informational actions, had to be used holistically in a full spectrum to achieve state aims. I should point out at this stage that none of this is exactly earth-shattering or new. This has been part of military doctrine for a long time.
You weaken the enemy psychologically, you sow confusion, and you sow discord, and it reduces the will to fight.
Absolutely, Minister. When the analyst parsed his words, the one point which seemed a little bit new and quite interesting was when he talked about the use of not just informational actions, but also seeding internal oppositions within the country itself. And this, maybe not earth-shattering, but seemed to cause a new wrinkle on how aggressors could perpetuate, far in advance of any armed or kinetic conflict, the undermining of the resilience in
the word fifth column has a long history.
Exactly, fifth column, Minister. If I can make a final observation on Gerasimov, the real military experts will point out that there is no Gerasimov doctrine. This is a simplification. What they actually mean is that if you look at the history of mass persuasion, particularly employed by the Soviets back to the Bolshevik Revolution, this has always been on the agenda. There is perhaps a newfangled terminology, a new verbiage, a new vocabulary attached to it. And indeed, some of Gerasimov's predecessors as Chief of General Staff, including Makarov, his immediate predecessor, deserve some of the credit for developing this doctrine further. So the hardcore analysts would say that Gerasimov doctrine is a bit of an oversimplification. But the point is that there's a new wrinkle being cast on old doctrine.
How does it relate to the original Soviet concept of disinformation or information warfare?
Minister, when I travel to some of these countries, including the Ukraine, and I'm given briefings on precisely that topic, it's interesting that every single official briefing starts with a history lecture on the Bolshevik Revolution from 1917. How, in order to achieve the aims of the revolution, the KGB, or the successor of the KGB, there's a name for it, the Cheka, and it's the other forebearers of the KGB, had to employ these tools and techniques of mass persuasion, samizdat, manuscript material circulated in private to subvert enemies and to convince its own people. So what you could say about the propagation of this kind of material nowadays is that they use new technological tools, perhaps, but the methods, the stratagems, the use of circulating material in a very underground guerrilla fashion to persuade people, mass persuasion, is perhaps not so new. There's a history to it.
What's new is the means of delivery of such.
Very, very potent, much more potent than in
Yes.
former times.
Now, this is one aspect, covert, using technology to subvert a country by seeding opposition, by seeding doubts, by targeting populations, by encouraging ethnic and racial and other sort of divisions and rivalries. There is another aspect of technology, which is a direct cyber attack to take down utilities, power stations, trains, airports, try and bring an entire country to a standstill, which we have read about, and some of it has been tried. How do you put this side by side? Are they two sides of a coin? Are they sort of overall using modern technology?
Minister, in my view, the best aggressive actors, state actors, have a full spectrum. And the full spectrum includes, on one end, kinetic warfare, insurgency, plausible deniability insurgency, little green men in the Ukraine, which will later turned out to be special forces commandos in Mufti, and then cyber attacks. The kinetic attacks, not simply malware, which can bring down, for example, the Ukrainian power grid, which actually did happen. Also instrumentalizing minorities in target countries, your minorities. Also, for example, the use of proxy NGOs and infiltrating them. And also, as in recently been alleged in Australia, for example, infiltrating community language newspapers of that particular language to appeal to the minority. And also, of course, disinformation on a more general scale, utilizing agents of influence and so on and so forth. The best of the actors in this game, Minister, use the full suite, but not necessarily the entire suite. They know when to chop and change, when to utilize that precise tool in the toolkit, when it suits their interests best. So that is my reading.
Right. Yeah. The next paragraph, you say the full story of what exactly Russia attempted in terms of opinion manipulation in the 2016 US presidential elections will probably not be apparent for some time to come. But you say, however, the scale and ingenuity were striking. Some researchers think they have found fake Facebook groups almost entirely populated by bots. These fake groups convincingly operated and orchestrated, but operated by bots and artificial intelligence, leveraged on existing ideological filter bubbles and echo chambers, eventually attracting real fans. Would you describe this in a little bit more? I mean, I want to understand, I think we need to understand, perhaps step by step, the modus operandi.
This is one of the most interesting and in some ways most compelling cases which has been uncovered by researchers and I think looked at by the security services as well. And a very good example was this fake Twitter account, and the name of the Twitter account was Jenna Abrams. I'll repeat that, Jenna Abrams, who seemed to be a normal, next-door, all-American, everyday kind of girl you meet on the street, very nice, likable, had a huge amount of Twitter followers, but clearly right-wing, far-right. And she induced many people to listen to her, to join her as Twitter followers. In other words, she created her own fan club. And she moved sentiment, she moved opinion as well. But much later on, after the election, researchers discovered the fact that this person did not exist at all. She had been a creation, allegedly, of the Russian state, possibly tied to the Internet Research Agency, which is Kremlin-linked, which has been fingered at the heart of some of the alleged election meddling in the US. To me, as a non-technical cyber expert, this is actually quite interesting because part of the process is clearly automated, and according to some experts, uses AI as well. But the best of these efforts, to my knowledge, actually use there's still a human agency at the back end because to understand the human condition, human motivation, what gets people to move, to think, AI hasn't got that good yet that the full process can be automated. So Jenna Abrams is just one. The suspicion of the people who really know is that there are many. There are many, many. What I find extremely interesting is that the real experts suggest that it's not simply Russian Kremlin-linked Internet Research Agency agencies like that which are pushing the far right in a way that's almost too obvious. There's some suggestion that they're pushing the far left as well, which on the face of it might seem ridiculous because there's no ideological common ground. However, the point, and I think this is actually the real point, is that when you see this dissension or when you undermine the national polity, it actually doesn't really matter who you push, so long as you push opposing forces, different ideological forces that cannot find common ground. And in one egregious example, I cannot remember the exact date, but it's roughly the time of the US election campaign. A fake account like Jenna Abrams actually got both sides, left and right, riled up enough to turn up for a fake protest.
This was in Texas.
I believe so, Minister.
Yeah.
So these fake accounts, powered partly by humans, partly by bots, can have very, very real-world consequences.
Yes. So the modus operandi, we can understand, one modus operandi, set up an account, make it attractive, build up a following, look as if it has got a following through using bots, so multiple likes and support and comments. And over a time, you build up a credible online presence. That then creates its own sort of movement and momentum. And real people then start joining.
Real people are sucked
Real
in.
people start joining.
And if it's very, very successful, the thing acquires a life of its own. So the fake aspects, after a while,
Yes.
can just wither away.
And then you seed sufficient remarks and comments and viewpoints to continue keep it bubbling and hot and try and divide this group from other groups and create friction.
Exactly, Minister.
That is the real purpose of all of this.
That's a real purpose.
Yeah.
The Russians would also, I have to add this, would have learned from the 2016 experience. The latest indications is that they are becoming even more sophisticated.
Even better.
It's not simply one Facebook account. Seeded by other fake Facebook accounts, which are extremely credible and believable.
Right.
AI or a security service has great difficulty in spotting the fake from the non-fake.
You say Russians, but presumably this expertise is available even to much smaller countries. Perhaps not at the same level as the Russians, but it's not very difficult to get this expertise.
It's not very difficult to hire it. So, Minister, there has been a proliferation of agencies which are sort of hired guns, which will parlay this kind of experience for the highest bidder. Cambridge Analytica is one of them. I understand it now has a presence in Malaysia, but there are others. I should point out, however, that the expert opinion on how effective these actually are is split. There are some who say to get the real subversion done, you do need some human agencies on the ground, focus groups, or human interventions on the ground to push these people.
But they're not difficult to do if you apply your mind.
Not difficult.
Okay, we'll come to that in a minute.
Yeah.
I think the point has been foreshadowed, but if you look at the page 3, second paragraph, you refer to individual consultants and private sector entities specializing in hacking or interfering with elections with the aim of achieving the desired election result for the client. Their methods include smears, hacking, spoofing, web pages, sending mass emails to influence outcomes. And you footnote it to a very Latin-sounding name, and you say that he rigged elections, or rather you quote a Bloomberg article where he rigged elections. Are you able to tell us a little bit more about this?
I apologize. Just give me a second to call up the...
Sorry, it's page 3.
Yes.
The second paragraph, and...
Under Sepulveda.
And then, Sepulveda, footnote 5.
Minister, he's a notorious hired gun for hire. He will go around primarily in Latin American countries. He is not simply a technical hacker. My understanding is he has some of these skills, but he's also very, very connected in Latin American countries, including some of the leaders. He will go around offering to rig elections for the highest bidders. Some of his methods would encompass those which are set out in the paragraph within. Not all are technical disinformation or subversion. He would also have some of the real-world interventions I'm talking about. For example, he would organize focus groups to understand the population or the electorate sentiment on the ground itself. He would organize smear campaigns, for example. He would do a lot of things, and he would offer them to the highest bidder, for example, to the politician who wanted to get elected. He was perhaps a little too clever for his own good. He advertised his methods in perhaps an overly public fashion, in my view. So he got caught, and I believe he's either awaiting trial or in jail right now. He's just one. He's the one well-known South American case. The smart ones, in my view, will not be as flamboyant or high-profile as him. They would probably be much more discreet in their methods, but they will be known to the people who matter.
All right. And in the next paragraph, you refer to, or you say, more broadly, there also appears to exist a, let's get it up on the screen first. More broadly, there also appears to exist a growing shadow market for methods to influence target populations, outcomes in nations, using methods like those offered by Cambridge Analytica, the company which is said by some reports to have profiled and micro-targeted the US electorate during the 2016 presidential elections. You referred to Cambridge Analytica earlier. Did you say they were in Malaysia now?
They have a presence in Malaysia.
They have a presence in Malaysia.
Yes.
Right.
And the talk is that they're being hired by people who are involved in the coming election.
Right. And everything you have set out here so far, what we've been discussing, is a fundamental root and branch subversion of democracy and free speech, isn't it?
Yes, Minister.
Thank you. What they are doing is using open systems and countries and using the very openness to undermine democracy and free speech.
Yes, Minister.
Thank you. Now, you then say in the next paragraph, military doctrine of major powers evolved to encompass the notion that information and propaganda are just as important as kinetic modes of subjugating the enemy, and you refer to a 1999 book, Unrestricted Warfare, by two relatively senior officers of the PLA. Would you, and they argued that in the face of American technological superiority, the non-kinetic actions might be more important to winning a conflict than weaponry. And the key, can we go over the page, please? The key in future conflicts would be to employ asymmetric attacks on all elements of national power, economic, political, information, and military, as a means to deter, intimidate, or defeat a militarily superior enemy. As the authors observed, nothing is off the table. I think you said a little bit about this earlier. Is there anything that you want to add to this?
The one point I would add, Minister, in my think tank, we have found it quite useful to study, I'll put this as a series of allegations as to what has been done in Australia and to a lesser degree New Zealand over the last couple of years, where there's a great fear over the alleged Chinese influence in that part of Australia. Interesting for my think tank because it is not cyber attack. It is not outright kinetic in any way, but to some degree, allegedly instrumentalizing the minority, Chinese minority, to some degree, trying those methods through the student population in that part of the world, to some degree, infiltrating NGOs, and to some degree, this has garnered the most attention, bribing politicians or paying off politicians. So it's interesting to study the full spectrum and to look at how a state quietly amasses power and influence within another state. And I think this will repay study in the years to come.
Right. Now, this aspect troubles me considerably in our own context, because as you know, we work on the basis that our conventional military capabilities are such that everyone knows that we can defend ourselves. And if I can refer you to some evidence that was given by Dr. Raska yesterday, I'll have it flashed across on the screen. Dr. Ruska's evidence at page 145, please. If you see my questions, Dr. Ruska, I'm interested in your views on the implications for Singapore, which you refer to in your paper. You talk about asymmetric warfare and information or disinformation campaigns being part of asymmetric warfare. What, in your view, are the implications when, say, a lot of people accept that Singapore's military power is substantial, that it is able to defend itself? Given that, what do you think would be the attractiveness of using asymmetric warfare, disinformation campaign against Singapore by a country that feels that it is not militarily able to challenge Singapore? And his answer, that's an excellent question. In a way, Singapore's deterrence and defense capabilities are second to none in the region. Let's assume he is right, that our deterrence and capabilities are superior to everyone in the region. But again, the changing character of conflict invites asymmetric type of strategies that may offset anyone's military inferiority and achieve similar political outcomes. So think about ways to bypass that power projection capabilities. That's a key point that I mentioned in the paper. In a way, cyber-enabled information conflicts essentially challenge Singapore concepts of deterrence. The different levels of potential attack short of war preclude Singapore's military type of action. So in other words, if Singapore is hit by cyber and information type of attack in conjunction with a terrorist attack, how does Singapore deter them in the first place, and how does Singapore respond to them militarily? Now, leave out for the time being terrorist attacks. Can we have your views as an expert in this area as well? On the assumption that militarily everyone understands that Singapore is able to well defend itself in conventional warfare, to what extent do you think there would be a likelihood, an incentive for countries that want to do us harm, or in the context of a deteriorating relationship? To what extent do you think a Chief of General Staff and his people will have to plan for and prepare for this against us? And if so, taking a leaf out of the Russian book, they should be planning for it much earlier to create the right conditions. To what extent would it be attractive to others? To what extent are we at risk on this, given the nature of our multiracial, multireligious society, and the nature of people who might want to do this to us, near and far?
Thank you, Minister. So I'll begin with the near first, and I don't want to cast allegations against, for example, our near neighbors whom we enjoy excellent
and neither do we. Yes.
Excellent relations with, and which show signs of continuing. However, we should look at it from this point of view. Information warfare is now slowly becoming, or it's evolved to become an accepted part of military doctrine. If you are the Chief of General Staff of any country, near or far, it will be a serious error not to incorporate these tenets into the planning for your military doctrine. Let's say, touch wood, in a worst-case scenario where we have a serious mishap in relations with one of our, again, near neighbors, it would be a mistake to assume that the means employed against us would be simply kinetic. Indeed, like the cyber, advanced, persistent threats, the best, most technical form of malware, which is employed long before you sense it, which resides within your system long before you detect it. And when you detect it, that means the communal resilience or the body politic has already started to fray. So that's the cyber. But if you take the informational warfare, I think it was Lenin who said that propaganda cannot just be words, it has to be action. So one actually thinks through how the militaries would, far in advance of any kinetic action, employ some of the means we are talking about. And again, without meaning to cast allegations or smears, the means and the tools are actually there because you have these hired guns for hire, which have a presence. The Ministry of Law Green Paper mentioned the Saracen phenomenon, this fake news mill or fake news farm in Indonesia, which is very, very important as well, because my understanding is that those kinds of techniques have thus far been used partly to bring down the Jakarta governor, and now for character assassinations against other very high-level politicians,
including the president.
Including the president himself, to smear him with allegations of being too close to China or the Chinese. These are just examples. But that's so far been limited to Indonesian domestic political machinations. But the tools and the stratagems can just, with one or two tweaks, be turned against Singapore itself in the event we have a serious mishap or falling out.